Welcome to Repros Fight Back, a podcast on all things related to sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. Hey Repros, how's everybody doing? I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and my pronouns are she, her. So y'all, I am looking forward to a long weekend. I'm recording this on Thursday before the holiday weekend because I was at a conference last weekend, so I'm taking an extra long weekend this weekend. But it threw my whole week off. I was convinced I was a day off all week since the conference started on Sunday for me. It meant I was had something on Wednesday and I was it's Thursday, and it threw my whole schedule off, just disaster. But I had so much fun. It was for NIFRA, and I got to meet a ton of wonderful family planning providers and a bunch of listeners. So, hey, it was so great to meet some of you in person, and welcome to any new listeners that I met at the conference. It really was wonderful to meet all of you and get to talk to you about the podcast and about the issues. It was wonderful to meet some of the wonderful teams from the U.S. government that were there that are also listeners or are new to the podcast. So just a big shout out to the huge team from OPA. I had so much fun talking to y'all, and it was great to meet some of you for the first time. So yeah, it was so much fun. And then so after the conference, I came back to work, and again, my week was all thrown off on what day it was. But then we had a staff outing to go to a national baseball game, which was so much fun, if super hot. But we were able to move up and sit in the shade, so then that made it better. But it was so great to go to a baseball game. I hadn't been in a very long time, and it was a lot of fun. I had all these grand intentions of eating all of this ballpark food, but I actually did not end up doing so. I feel it was hot, and the thought of getting up and going and getting it, I was being lazy. But that's okay. It was probably better I didn't go eat that bucket of cotton candy, even though I was really tempted. Let's see, what else? Just really looking forward to the long weekend. I have no plans. I'm really exhausted after having to do 3 full days of in-person peopling, and then had a really busy day today when I was just trying to get caught up on work, but just had all these other things that had meetings I had to have because I wasn't available the rest of the week. So it's just been a lot, and I am very much looking forward to doing nothing all weekend. So probably do some reading, watch some movies, maybe spend a little time outside, but mostly just having some quiet introvert time, and I am so excited for it. I think with that, let's turn to this week's episode because I'm very, very excited for it, y'all. I have 2 just amazing young researchers that are just going to be, they are rising stars, and I think we're going to be seeing big things from them. And I'm so excited that they're on the podcast. I get to work with them every day. Well, maybe not every day, but I get to work with them a lot. They work at Population Institute with me, and they are just so amazing. And I'm so excited to talk to them about this wonderful report that they put out earlier this year called Behind Closed Doors. We'll have links to it in our show notes. Y'all should definitely read it. It's such a great read and really important read, but it's also just stunningly beautiful. The artwork in it is gorgeous. It is just a gorgeous report front to back and has so much important information on it. And I am so excited that I get to let them shine today on the podcast. So with that, let's go to my interview with Amani Nelson and Maniza Habib, both with the Population Institute, and 2, like I said, rising star researchers that I am lucky enough to get to call colleagues. Hi, Amani and Maniza. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. This is very exciting.
I am so excited to have you 2 here. One, because of your amazing report, but also I love getting a chance to show off how smart you 2 are and all of the amazing work you're doing. So it makes my heart happy to have you here. So thank you for doing it. So let's first, before we dive into the report, I've been terrible at I get excited and forget to ask people to introduce themselves. So let's not do that today. Let's have y'all introduce yourself. Maniza, do you want to go first?
Yeah, my name is Maniza Habib. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the research associate at Population Institute.
My name is Amani Nelson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a research fellow at Population Institute.
So, like I said, I'm so excited for the two of you to be here. The report you wrote is first, y'all, it is gorgeous. You should make sure to look at it because they worked with the designer to make just this stunningly beautiful report. But also it's a really important report and definitely worth a read. But I'm so excited to talk about it today. Do we want to do a quick overview? Because I think it's really good to frame it a little bit before we get into the sections.
Sure, yeah. Well, Behind Closed Doors, that's what the report is called. It's essentially a report that ties together different gender-based harms that we typically think of as foreign things that don't happen in the United States. So what we wanted to do is put these together and show how they impact a range of communities within the United States, and therefore we can develop, sustainable solutions to respond to them better. And these different gender-based harms that we include in the report are female genital mutilation / cutting, or FGMC, child and forced marriage, virginity testing, and femicide.
Yeah, and our two main goals with this report were really about, number one, impacting policy and policymakers. We really feel like there's a need in the United States for policymakers to recognize the prevalence of these kinds of gender-based harms and how much they really are rooted in American culture. And then our second goal was really wanting to show that you can have a culturally competent and intersectional approach to addressing these kinds of harms. And so whether that's in the form of survivor-led and focused initiatives, more robust research and analysis, and just investment across multiple sectors, be them medical, religious, social, or institutional. But yeah, those were really our two main goals when we were making this report.
I think it's so great because, like you said, all of these issues are ones that I think people don't think of in a U.S. context. The conversations are bubbling up more, but it's in specific spaces, right? So if you're not in kind of the gender conversation space, on the ground, you may not be as familiar with how these harms are showing up in the U.S. And so I think it's such important work to raise all of them because, again, you may know about specific ones. You may know about child marriage if you're in that community, and FGM if you're in that community, but not all of it interconnected, which I think is such an important part of what this report does.
Yeah, exactly that. Just to add on, I feel like when we don't recognize these gender-based harms, we're not recognizing the culture of toxic masculinity that exists within the United States. It's very, very much present across the globe, and we're part of that conversation, and we should be more part of it.
Great. Okay, so I think the first section we should touch on is the FGMC section. And maybe just a quick step back of maybe some people aren't as familiar of that. I know we haven't talked about it on the podcast a ton, but some good framing would be nice too.
Yeah, well, FGMC is essentially defined as the partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or any kind of injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. It has no health benefits, it's completely a human rights violation, and it has a lot of harm that it carries. So typically, individuals are cut anytime between birth and 15 years of age, but it can happen at any time. It's often carried out by traditional practitioners or birth attendants, a relative, sometimes healthcare professionals in medical settings. And it's often done for misguided reasons in preserving cultural identity or maintaining social status, promoting chastity and marriageability, upkeep of cleanliness and beauty, and then there are also just misconceptions about fertility associated with FGMC. But in the end of the day, it doesn't do any of those things. It causes irreparable change to the female genitalia, which can cause severe pain and excessive bleeding, and can sometimes even lead to death. So over 230 million women are impacted worldwide, and over 500,000 women and girls are either at risk or have undergone FGMC just within the United States. And these numbers are based on limited small-scale studies across the world and are definitely not inclusive of all who are impacted. And within the United States, they're only based on indirect estimates, based on who you are. So it's leaving off a lot of cultures that might perform FGMC, and overestimating for other cultures that also do perform FGMC, but overestimating for those that live here.
Yeah, and those numbers that Maniza was mentioning, I think for the United States, our most recent data is from 2013. So there really is a need for further investment in finding out exactly how many women and girls in the United States are at risk, because this is one of those issues that, is every conversation around it is almost exclusively outside the United States. And the other thing we touched on in our report, which is kind of weaved throughout, but we also have a special section for it, is how these gender-based harms disproportionately affect the LGBTQ community. And a huge concern for LGBTQ activists is bodily autonomy. And things like female genital mutilation can sometimes be used as a way of suppressing or subverting someone's sexuality or gender expression. And so these issues disproportionately affect LGBTQ people as well.
I think that's so important to talk about. And it's also just important to talk about that we do see FGM in the US. And, one of the things this was like big, like you said, with the 2013 data, there was like a big push around it then, was concerns over, one, starting to see the medicalization of it, but also when people show up for delivery and like doctors being confronted with something they aren't familiar with, or like knowing how to deal with it. Like there are real impacts that like last throughout your life, and like that healthcare professionals need to be aware of. And the silence around it harms not only the survivors at the time and like allows the practice to continue, but then later in life when they may encounter the healthcare system in a different way.
Yeah, exactly this. Like most healthcare providers are overwhelmingly unprepared to respond to the needs of survivors of FGMC. And even like, I've spoken to a few individuals. It's not always just about the care, but even they're scared to go in and show because of the face that they'll see. Like they're just going to be a reaction. And that reaction itself is traumatic. And it reminds you of like how traumatizing your situation was and how you look different and all those things. So there is just a need for more education, more awareness building of just, how not to make a face when you see it, because you're more familiar with what it looks like and different things like that. So I think you really hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and that's one of those, again, sort of more survivor-focused initiatives that we really tried to bring to light in this report, because, you may look at something like FGMC in the United States and think, oh, well, this is a policy issue. We need more laws across more states that don't allow for vacation cutting or FGMC and things like that. But that multi-sectoral approach with medical institutions, medical ethics is an important component. And that perspective is something you really only get when you actually talk to survivors of this kind of thing and what they're facing in their day-to-day life.
And to maybe take one quick second, because people may not be familiar, what is vacation cutting?
Well, vacation cutting is when individuals are taken out of the country to have FGMC done in a different country where the rules might be more lax or it's easier to get done, and then they come back. So we do currently have the Stop FGMC Act of 2020 that does make vacation cutting illegal and makes FGMC illegal in the United States. It does include education provisions for enforcement in communities and does make an attempt for more data collection, but a lot of these things aren't happening. There's not a lot of evaluation and monitoring of these things that were asked upon in the federal law. And there's also 9 states and Washington, D.C. that still don't have a ban on FGMC. In addition to these survivor-focused initiatives and these educational components, there is still a need for laws that strictly ban this to show that we are anti-FGMC, and then also put more funding towards like robust data collection and prevention and training programs, because things like vacation cutting can still happen, but we're not sure of it happening. But at the end of the day, we just have to prioritize the needs of those most vulnerable and those advocating for it within the community, and really listen to what they're asking for. There are different coalitions within each state that are asking for very specific things. But at the end of the day, it's just about destigmatizing this dialogue around FGMC, recognizing that it's happening, and then also knowing how to respond when it happens.
Yeah, silence really can just breed stigma around all of these issues we're going to talk about today. So I think one of the next ones, and often you hear them kind of in concert together, is child early and forced marriage, particularly on the global scale, like that you often hear them together. But let's talk a little bit about how does that show up in the U.S.?
Well, in the United States, there was an estimated 300,000 married minors within the 2000 to 2018. And this is significant. There shouldn't be one, is what it is at the end of the day. And while there have been some work to create more bans on child marriage within the United States, and definitely globally, there are certain loopholes in state laws that allow minors to get married under certain circumstances, such as like parental consent or court approval, different things like that. There's just a lack of uniformity across state laws. So currently only 11 states have effectively banned child marriage, beginning with Delaware and New Jersey just in 2018. So it's pretty recent development. And the most recent state was Virginia just earlier this year. And we still have so many states that have so many loopholes, no laws at all, and just many, many minors just falling through in the system. And part of this is probably due to this type of American exceptionalism, which is this idea that America is superior, like morally superior to the rest of the world. And therefore, we do not need those laws. That is not happening here. So that coupled with this fear of threat to our sovereignty, like state sovereignty and our sovereignty in discussions with the world on child marriage, affects and impedes on our ability to protect vulnerable minors in the United States.
Yeah, and you were talking about, these more recent laws. I believe there was a child marriage ban in Missouri that just died in legislature. They had the votes, but they felt that it was too, quote unquote, controversial of a bill to bring forward at this time, which is just crazy when you're talking about literally things like child marriage. And I think the fact that something like that can't even get passed in the United States, local legislature is evidence of the fact that this is a deep-rooted American issue. And child marriage, forced marriage is another one of those harmful gender-based practices that we see can disproportionately affect LGBTQ people. It's, again, just another way of sort of forcing conformity of gender and sexuality onto LGBTQ plus identifying individuals. And another issue that we talked about in this report that is closely tied to child marriage and female genital mutilation is virginity testing. And for those who aren't familiar, virginity testing is essentially a pseudoscience where you would perform a gynecological inspection of female genitalia to assess one's virginity, but there is no clinical basis that exists for the procedure, but it is still something that occurs in the United States fairly often and is, again, just another issue that we don't think of as being deeply American, but is just another way of sort of enforcing both a gender binary and traditional gender expression and ascribing morality to women and their sexual activities.
Amani and I were just talking about the other day, the rapper T.I., just a few years ago, was very publicly, he claims this was a joke, but talking about how he virginity tests his child every year.
Yep.
My God, I totally forgot about that. Like, totally black holed it. That was, yes.
It's absolutely ridiculous. So, clearly it's present. Clearly it's something that, whether jokingly or not, it's happening. So... And I think also just to add on, child marriage is this unique issue where there's pushback on child marriage bans from both progressives and conservatives for different reasons. Conservatives being this fear of a threat to religious freedom and the ability to exercise traditional religious values. And then from progressives, there's this fear that it will impede on the sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people. But I think the main thing to go back to and recognize is that child marriage itself impedes on an individual's right to bodily autonomy and the freedom of choice and family planning decisions. So young people need to be allowed to make decisions that affect their future, and they need to be allowed to access SRHR services and but also not be trapped in a legal contract that they do not have a power to end, which is what child marriage is.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that is something that is, we talk about the ability to consent, right? So that young people need to be able to consent to birth control, to healthcare, to various things, but entering into a legal contract that you are unable to get out of is very different than being able to consent to healthcare. And I think that's a really important point to raise.
No, exactly. It's just, ending child marriage just requires such careful consideration of the specific needs of married adolescents and at-risk individuals too. And that includes being able to access sexual and reproductive health services, but also understanding that they may be entering into a legal contract they cannot end or do not want to enter in the first place. So we need to provide protection for them. So also just tackling this issue in general requires considering the root causes of gender inequality and exclusion that drive child marriage in the first place. There's just a lot that goes into just that idea of valuing or devaluing a girl's sexuality, a woman's sexuality, and thinking of it as a commodity. So protecting girls from that is of utmost importance.
I also thought it was important you raised the Missouri and how it got pulled. Now I'm not going to remember when this happened because it feels like forever ago, but again, time, no meaning. A number of years ago, there was a bill in Congress around global child marriage that was coasting along to it was going to easily pass. And then all of a sudden it got flagged as an abortion-related bill, which, to be very clear, was not, even though, like you said, child marriage has very clear implications for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it got pulled because they lost all of this support because it was said that it was an abortion-related bill. And I do have concerns as we're seeing things become more and more abortion and gender and getting flagged as expanding those areas that you could slow down some of the progress you're seeing. Okay. The next section you talk about femicide, and I think that is definitely something that I have thought much less about in a U.S. context, so I was extra excited to see this in the report. Do you want to talk a little bit about that section?
Yeah, definitely. So femicide is essentially the killing of a woman or girl because of her gender or her perceived gender, and in the United States, the rate of femicide is about 2.2 per 100,000 women, or it was in 2021. And more than half of these, I believe more than half of intimate partner related femicides occur with a firearm. And there is an upcoming Supreme Court case that is pending. It's called the United States versus Rahimi, and it could essentially loosen a loophole that allows people under domestic violence restraining orders to obtain guns. And on the theory that depriving them of guns is a violation of their Second Amendment rights, should, these laws banning people with protective orders against them or other people convicted of intimate partner violence be struck down, we would see a huge increased risk for women and girls in the United States when it comes to femicide. And femicide is also one of those harmful gender-based practices that we see very much disproportionately affects women of color. I believe Black women and girls are murdered by men at almost 3 times the rate of white women. And I believe Native American and Native Alaskan women and girls have the second highest rate of femicide in the United States. So it's one of those issues that, again, far-reaching, extremely prevalent, especially considering the United States relationship with firearms, but not something that is talked about nearly often enough.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about the Supreme Court case that we're waiting on the decision for, there is an episode of Repros Fight Back where I talk to Sabrina, I forgot her last name, at the Center for American Progress, where we talk all about the case and its implications and originalism on the Supreme Court. So you can do a deeper dive if you are interested in learning more about that case. And yeah, this is such an important topic to talk about. One, intimate partner violence is one of those issues that's near and dear to my heart, but also just, again, seeing how Black women and Native women are so disproportionately impacted is always really important to raise those alarm bells, particularly if that this Supreme Court case could loosen the restrictions on people convicted of domestic violence or under a restraining order for domestic violence from accessing guns?
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those things, kind of, pattern with all of the gender-based harms that we're talking about, just a reluctance to admit that it's happening and why it's happening. So it's not survivor focused the way we approach this. The fact that we are even considering loosening the firearm policy for those that are under restraining orders, domestic violence restraining orders that is evidence of that. So currently we do have the Violence Against Women Act, which is from 1994, and it has been reauthorized 4 times in subsequent years. And this has been effective in expanding federal criminal response to gender-based violence and creating grant programs, increasing tribal power in addressing violence, and establishing protections for vulnerable populations. But it has also been criticized for the disproportionate focus that it has on criminalization, which sometimes can just be harmful for those that are experiencing intimate partner violence or at risk of femicide, and it can overshadow other effective strategies to combat femicide. And there's, again, that problem with monitoring evaluation. There's some causal claims made about VAWA's effectiveness on decreasing intimate partner violence, but there are no robust evaluation efforts to assert this claim. But still, that VAWA remains a primary funding stream for agencies intervening and responding to issues of gender-based violence, yet doesn't really have this attention and survivor-led informed initiatives and community investments in addressing harmful gender-based practices, but rather more of a focus on policing and enforcement.
Yeah, and you really can't talk about this issue of, femicide, killing women and girls for gender or perceived gender, without talking about how it affects trans women, and particularly Black trans women in the United States. Because I believe right now, I think the life expectancy for Black trans women in the U.S. is hovering somewhere around 33 years of age. And that is largely due to the fact that they are murdered at disproportionate rates. And, that's why we specifically say for someone's gender or their perceived gender. And that's because a lot of the kind of violence and harms that we're talking about are rooted in patriarchal society, and LGBTQ individuals, particularly trans women, are often wrongly viewed as either a threat or as liars by men who kill for those, again, deeply rooted patriarchal reasons. And that issue is also tied to firearms, because in 2023, I believe 80% of homicides of transgender people were with a firearm. And so that's the kind of issue that, again, there's a reluctance to, like Maniza said, to recognize that this is happening, and that it is happening at such a alarming rate for such a vulnerable group of people. But that's why the issue, needs to be discussed, and why we need to talk about issues beyond, talk about solutions rather, beyond criminalization, beyond, just funding more money for police, because there are oftentimes these most vulnerable groups are not going to be helped by those kinds of solutions.
I think it's also really important to connect the things both of you said, talking about VAWA and then talking about the most vulnerable groups. The last reauthorization, actually the last couple, I feel like reauthorizations of VAWA has been a big fight about expanding who is even covered under VAWA. And it was exactly those, right? It was the most vulnerable groups. It was around expanding it to Native women. It was around expanding it to LGBTQ people. And there was a real fight, and then VAWA got hung up, and there was a really long lapse between when reauth was needed and when it happened, for including those more vulnerable groups and groups that were covered by VAWA. And you're right, we need to also be looking at preventative things, clearly, right? There is a lot of work that needs to be done on that end to prevent this kind of violence from happening in the first place. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation talking about the report, and I love that you had solutions throughout. Is there something the audience can do to help around any of these things? What actions can the audience take around all of these issues?
First and foremost, if you are interested in helping or advocating or, around these issues, is looking in your own backyard, looking in your state, in your city, what kind of policies and laws are in place. And, with the kinds of things that we're talking about with child marriage and femicide, a lot of times we see, oh, there's, a ban on child marriage in this state. Excellent. Well, there may be loopholes. There may be, other ways that things like that are happening. So advocating for stronger state and federal policy frameworks and paying attention to, when these kinds of things are in the news, are people talking about this only internationally, or, are there pieces coming out more from a domestic focus, and educating yourself on these topics so that you're not using sort of those more harmful kind of language that we were trying to avoid, especially when talking about these more sensitive topics. When we're talking about femicide, like, we would never use the term honor killings, even though just because that is deeply steeped in, problematic and racist language that, again, is inherently like talking about this as a non-American issue. And then just investing in community through, further funding and research and advocating for those kinds of things, but also, again, the multi-sectoral approach that we're talking about from medical, religious, social institutions.
Yeah, exactly that. Addressing, like, what are your biases? Like, how can you address those? How do you contribute to this, like, unresponsive culture that we have? Like, what are you ignoring in your community? Because even in your own job, you're probably interacting with other people, you are responding to things, you have a certain mindset that you have when you go to your job, and, like, is it part of your job? Like, can you do something that can change the framing around this? And I feel like an important thing to remember is that anyone can get more involved with these, like, survivor focus and led initiatives that we keep bringing up. Like, some of the collaborators on our project, which are organizations such as, like, CEFMU, which works to end female genital mutilation, and Unchained at Last, which is working to end child marriage in the United States, they do different activities. They go state to state, advocate for stricter laws, promote more awareness for survivors, and release survivor stories, different things like that. So you can engage with these things and just educate yourself. Or you can read behind closed doors, because that is also a resource that does that. And I think another really important thing we haven't really talked about too much is advocating for comprehensive sexuality education within your local community, within your schools, because this type of early education can be, like, monumental in changing harmful attitudes towards sexuality of women and girls, and also anyone. Become more aware of gender diverse individuals. Just in general, could be a cultural game changer for all of these gender-based harms that we've mentioned, and kind of tackle toxic masculinity from the beginning. So that's something that's super important that people in the audience can do.
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's comprehensive sex education is something that's been in the news around, the United States a bunch. It's kind of become a bit of a battleground in schools, unfortunately. But I think a lot of times what's misunderstood is exactly what goes into comprehensive sex education. When we're talking about CSE for kids as young as, 5, 6, 7, people think like, oh, you're teaching children about sex, like, that's so wrong. It's like, comprehensive sex education is about teaching kids what a harmful relationship looks like. It is teaching kids about harmful gender roles, what those look like. And the earlier and more widespread that kind of knowledge is, like Maniza said, like, that is when it becomes a cultural shift in terms of these issues of toxic masculinity, toxic and harmful gender-based practices. That is really where they begin, is when kids are, these types of gender binaries and gender, harmful gender-based violence are taught early and taught at home. And so that's one of the reasons why comprehensive sex education is so vitally important, especially for young children.
Yeah, and you can teach consent really early, right? Like, we're not talking about, like, consent to sex, but, like, I don't want to hug this person, or, like, touch, and, like, there's just very simple things that you can build up over the course of teaching comprehensive sexuality education from a young age. And it makes a huge difference. And teaching healthy relationships, like you said, huge difference in people's lives.
Exactly. I feel like the overwhelming response we get to a lot of these when we're talking about these gender-based harms featured in behind closed doors is like, oh, that happens here? And the answer is yes, it does happen. And the second thing is, yes, we have a responsibility to address them as a community. And I feel like comprehensive sex ed is, like, a huge way to do that.
It's right there. Maniza, Amani. It was so delightful to get to talk to you today. I really enjoyed getting to show you off to my audience. I think you are two amazing researchers who are going to go a long ways. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. This has been amazing.
Okay, y'all. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Amani and Maniza. I had so much fun talking to them. I think they did such an outstanding job on the podcast. And like I said, I expect to see big things from them over the years. They're so smart and they are such wonderful researchers and just such thoughtful people. I'm so excited to see what they do in the future. And with that, I will see you all next week. If you have any questions, comments, or topics you would like us to cover, always feel free to shoot me an email. You can reach me at Jenny, Jennie, at reprosfightback.com, or you can find us on social media. We're at Repros Fight Back on Facebook and Twitter, or Repros FB on Instagram. If you love our podcast and want to make sure more people find it, take the time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Or if you want to make sure to support the podcast, you can also donate on our website at reprosfightback.com. Thanks all.